Hi, my name is Ruth Hanford Morhard, and I'm delighted to be part of the Lakewood Meet the Author series. My book is called Mrs. Morhard and the Boys, and it's the wonderful story of a woman right here in Cleveland who started the first boys' baseball leagues. I'll tell you a little bit about myself before we go any further with the book. This is my second book. My first book was called Wired to Move, and it's about boys' brains and how they work differently from girls, and how early childhood teachers need to change the way that they teach. I've been a writer for a long time, but I've mainly been writing for other people. This book gave me a chance to do something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. Many years ago, I was very interested in what was then called the new journalism. Now you hear it referred to more as creative nonfiction or narrative nonfiction, where you don't just talk about the facts, you don't just write about the facts, you put them in a scene, and you make the person feel like they're right there. It's still nonfiction, but I think it's a little more interesting, and that's what I've tried to do with Mrs. Morhard and the Boys. If you look at the book, you'll see there's a baseball, there's a picture of some small boys in little Cleveland Indians uniforms. So obviously this is a story about baseball, but it's not the typical story about baseball, because there's also a woman in the picture. And the title is Mrs. Morhard and the Boys. It's an amazing story, but it's about much more than baseball. When I first encountered this story, I thought I was just going to write about baseball. But Mrs. Morhard had such an amazing life that I decided to make it much more. The story, I've been looking for something. I've been wanting to write something on my own, because in my day job I write mainly for other people. And this story just kind of fell into my lap unexpectedly. I had come to Cleveland for a job, and I had met Al Morhard, who is now my husband, and his mother had just passed away. I had only met her a couple of times. We were cleaning out her house, and all of a sudden I saw a huge can of film, 16mm film. On the side it said, "Bringing Up Baseball." Well, I of course was curious about the film, so I asked him what it was about. He said, "It's about my mother. She started the Little League." I said, "You mean in Cleveland?" He said, "No, she started the Little League. The Cleveland Indians made that film about her and sent it to cities all over the country, including Williamsport, Pennsylvania, the town now credited with the beginnings of the Little League." So obviously, my first impression was, sure, yeah, I'm not sure I believe this story. But I was curious. So we rented a 16mm projector, and as it cranked through the film, I'm seeing the title, "Bringing Up Baseball," and it's narrated by Pinky Hunter. Well, Pinky Hunter happened to be one of the announcers for the Cleveland Indians, along with Jack Graney, back in the late 1930s and early 1940s. As the film went on, I see Mrs. Morhard standing on the porch of her house, shouting down to a group of boys playing baseball in her backyard. The next scene, I see she's standing on a beautiful field with bleachers, with a backstop, with moms and dads in hats and suits, and there are boys playing on the field, looking like almost like pros. So I said, I need to do something with this. Now, Mrs. Morhard was known across the country back in the day, but everyone had forgotten her story. So I wanted to do something. I wanted to bring it back and get her some recognition that she obviously did not have today. So the first thing I found, and it was in my husband's nightstand, was a notebook. It was an old stenography notebook. The pages were yellow. There were a few typed pages, but most of it was handwritten. And it talked about her early life. Well, her early life was one of the most amazing stories I'd ever read. She was one of 17 children. She left the farm and her home when she was only 12. And you can just imagine the kind of life she must have had. When she was on the farm, she was always getting into scrapes. At one point, she burned down the pig's barn without really realizing what she had done, and was absolutely horrified that she had done it. Another time, she decided to come up with a solution. She liked fishing, but she didn't like the length of time it took. So the farm was down in Bessemer, Pennsylvania, which is near Youngstown. And there were limestone mines nearby, and they used explosives. So there was she found some explosives on part of her farm, of the farmland, and she decided to put them in the water to try to make the fish come up quicker. She did that, and the game warden came along, and that was the end of that little strategy. I kind of think of her as Tom Sawyer in a petticoat, because she was always getting into scrapes, but she was determined. She was the hardest worker on the farm. Her father counted on her for everything, and she often felt his riding whip on her backside when she did something wrong. Well, she got tired of the hard work on the farm and decided to leave, and she did at 12 years old. And it was a terrible struggle for her. She just wandered from town to town. She was always looking for a place to live. She needed a place to live. She needed to make money, and all she could find was work as a domestic, or or taking care of children. Her life was very difficult. At times, she only had ginger snaps and peanuts to eat. She was a young girl, and a lot of men tried to take advantage of her, and you can just imagine some of the situations that she was in. Well, later on, she managed to get a stenography. She managed to learn stenography and was able to start doing that. But her life had been so difficult. She met a man who was quite charming, quite brilliant, and she married him. What she didn't know was he was the kind of person that went from place to place trying to make big money, and unfortunately had wives just about everywhere he lived. He went to the coal fields in West Virginia. He went to the oil fields in California. And he was actually quite well known. He was written up in a lot of papers, and she was absolutely charmed. So she packed up with him, and they went down to Florida. Florida was in the midst of a land boom, and he was making tons and tons of money, and they were living very high. They hobnobbed with people like the Ringlings from the Barnum and Bailey circus family. Unfortunately, the boom went bust. He lost all of his money. They came back to Cleveland. He ended up becoming an alcoholic. Eventually he abandoned her. She tried to get a divorce, and he couldn't be found. Finally, she got a divorce, and believe me, at that time, getting a divorce was very much stigmatized. Soon after, they had a daughter, Geraldine. But soon afterwards, she met another man, another charming man, a German immigrant named Albert Morhard, who owned a meat market. Eventually, he had 3 meat markets. And life was going along well for a while, but I don't know whether the success went to his head or what happened. But he also became an alcoholic. And he was also very, very violent. They had a son, Albert, whom they called Junior. Now, Albert had seen his father drunk. He had seen his father choke his mother. He had seen him punch her. He had seen him chase her around the dining room table with a butcher knife, and it left a terrible impact. she didn't know what to do with him. He was starting to act out himself. One of the things, when he shot out a neighbor's leaded glass windows with a BB gun, she was panic-stricken. She didn't know what to do because she had to work. She got one of the meat markets in the divorce, and she had to work, and she couldn't be there with him all the time, even though she had someone to take care of him. So one day, she's looking out the front window. It was a Sunday, her only day off work, and she sees Junior out in the street hitting at a tennis ball with a 2x4. And all of a sudden, a light bulb went off. Maybe she could get him involved in baseball. They were both huge baseball fans. They listened as often as they could, and whenever she could, she'd bring him down to a Cleveland Indians game. So she went up to the mayor's office and asked the mayor if he knew of any teams. Well, he didn't, but he said that they could use the field in back of town hall. Well, they did that for a while, and this was in 1937, and that was the beginning. It wasn't long before she wanted to have a real field for the boys because the balls were rolling in the street and there really wasn't space for an outfield. So she went up to she and Junior were out wanting to get something to eat, and they went to a place called Lenny's Chicken in the Basket. And at Lenny's Chicken in the Basket, there was a huge field. It was full of papers, and the grass was knee-high, and bottles, and you can imagine. But she thought that could be a good field for the boys. So she found out who the developer was. She told the developer that the boys really needed a field, and she'd like to use that one. And I think he was a little bit stunned, but he said, fine. He said, as long as I don't need it. And she proceeded to get the mayor to bring his city crews to level the field and create an infield, and with help from the boys and obviously from her. Well, that was the beginning. When Mrs. Morhard did anything, she wanted to do it right. Her vision was to have a team that was a model that modeled after the big leagues. She wanted to have the Little Indians. So she started the team called the Little Indians, and the boys were, starting at 8 years old to about 12. She went down to the neighborhood. She went down to the neighborhood sporting goods store, and a man there named Laddie Plasek, she said she wanted to get authentic Cleveland Indians uniforms for the boys. He just happened to not only be a salesman there, but he was also one of the scouts for the Cleveland Indians. So that was lucky. So he got her uniforms at cost. Well, before long, she had a junior American League and she had a junior National League. And they were the toast of the town. The Indians got involved. They just thought having little Indians and little, mini major league teams was wonderful. And so they helped in a lot of ways. And so did the players. Bob Feller, Jeff Heath, and Roy Weatherly used to come and they used to play with the boys in the back Mrs. Morhard's backyard. They would they'd show the boys how to hit and pitch and field and catch. The Indian Scouts had baseball clinics for the boys. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. But Mrs. Morhard also had rules. If you were going to play on the team, you had to show respect and good sportsmanship. She even had the boys, before they were allowed on the field, they had to tell her about a good deed they've done the day before. So all of a sudden, these previously mischievous boys were going down to the neighborhood grocery store, and they were helping the little old ladies with their packages. And I think the town didn't know what on earth had happened to these boys. But that was her main purpose, was to help her son and help these neighborhood boys. They were all poor. It was the middle of the Depression. She was struggling. Everybody was struggling. She had a meat market that was failing, and she was trying to keep it afloat. Cleveland at the time had been hard hit by the Depression. It had been Cleveland was, believe it or not, the 5th largest city in the country at the time. But a quarter of its population was out of work. and half of its industrial workers were out of work. And one thing that really lifted their spirits was baseball. People would go down to the stadium, and sometimes the only meal they had for the entire day was a hot dog that they got at the stadium. So it was a very tough time, and it was hard for her to run the leagues and keep the meat market afloat, but she did it. And she did it as well as she could. The Indians got very involved. They gave baseballs. Alva Bradley was the owner at the time. He used to have the boys over. Mel Harder, who was one of the great pitchers and pitching coaches of the Indians, would often stop by the games, and he'd invite the boys over for soda pop and popcorn, and he'd regale them with stories of the Cleveland Indians. I mean, you can just imagine how the boys felt about being so close to their heroes and having their heroes actually teach them to play baseball. Well, she had started the leagues in 1937, and as you can imagine, it was difficult. By around the early 1940s, the war was starting in, well, not just starting in Europe, the war was pretty much taking over most of Europe. After she had formed the Junior National League, she wanted to have a Little World Series. So she again went to the Indians management and asked if they could play the Little World Series in League Park, which was then the weekday home of the Cleveland Indians. And what a great thrill it would be for the boys to do that. They said, fine. The Indians happened to be out of town on one Sunday on, let's see, it was September the 28th, 1941. The Indians were out of town, and the Little Indians were going to play the Little Cardinals. Both were champions of their respective leagues. So she wanted to do something for the war in Europe. So she sold the tickets at all the downtown department stores. And the proceeds were going to go to British war relief. Britain was standing alone at the time. Actually, a lot of British people were sending their children to the United States because they didn't know what would happen, feeling that Germany was going to be after them next. And one of the boys actually became a neighbor of the Morhards. His name was Tony Steele, and his parents had sent him over just so he would be safe. And also, a lot of the parents were doing that because they wanted to make sure there would be another generation. So anyway, so the proceeds went to British war relief, especially to the British children. And they had the Little World Series in League Park, and it was a beautiful sunny day. The Little Indians and the Little Cardinals, they didn't play a full, what the major leaguers play. But in the last inning, the Little Cardinals were ahead. And Mrs. Morhard all of a sudden marched across the field and said, one of my rules is for all of these leagues is that every boy has to play. So she made sure all of her boys played, and she made sure all of the Little Cardinals played. Well, what happened was the Little Indians ended up winning. And it could be because the Little Cardinals had to put in some of their players who were not their best players. But at any rate, she had made sure that all of her players played in the game as well. But imagine what a wonderful experience that would have been for the boys. They talk about it today. When Al and I would walk down the street or go to reunions of the class, people would come up to him and talk about how much Mrs. Morhard meant to them. And even 30 years later, they decided to have a reunion of the players, and the Cleveland Indians managers were there. Hal Leibowitz, who was the sports editor of the Plain Dealer and contributed columns to the Sporting News, had been one of her umpires And he was also a bit of a coach to the boys too. After umpiring the game, he'd often stop by and get the boys together and say, okay, what do you think you did right and what do you think you did wrong in the game? And they'd tell him, and he said they were usually right. He was there. In one of his columns many years later, he said that University Heights, Ohio, which is where the ball fields were, might have been the home of Little League today if the war hadn't come along. But the war did come along. And in 1941, if you remember, I said it was September, the Little League World Series was September 28th, 1941. Well, you remember that 2 months later, Pearl Harbor happened. So things changed. Mrs. Morhard kept the leagues going for, well, until 1944. Actually, 1942 was the best year. She had so many teams in the leagues, and everybody wanted to join, but the problem was people were getting drafted. Bob Feller was one of the first to enlist. Fathers were getting drafted, mothers were going to work, gas was being rationed, and it was very difficult for the kids to get to the games. In addition, she was running a meat market, and meat was being rationed. So it was very difficult. She had been holding fundraisers to raise money for the leagues, but meat was rationed, and so again, her business was off. So very, very reluctantly, after the 1944 season, she stopped the leagues. Now, Little League, in 1941, Carl Stotz, who is the man credited with founding today's Little League, called her and wanted to see a copy of the film. Now, we don't know what influence that may have made, but he did see the film and he talked to her at length about her leagues. And her leagues were being publicized across the country. I have clippings from newspapers from Maine to Florida to New Mexico, all over the country, talking about her leagues, talking about her, and talking about the players. And some of the players were absolutely amazing. There was one who was an orphan from Parmadale who could do anything. He could pitch right or left-handed, and in his off days, he was a shortstop. And his name was Marlo Termini. And he became a great basketball coach, even though he was only 5'2". Another one was Jack Heinen, and I'm sure many people know Heinen Supermarkets. Jack Heinen was also a pitcher who went on to pitch at Stanford, where they thought he was just an outstanding pitcher. The Boston Red Sox brought him to the minor leagues. Then he was drafted. Then after the war, he came back to a Red Sox minor league team in California, where he pitched a no-hitter, and his ERA was just astounding. Well, the Red Sox wanted to bring him to spring training, so he called his father, who had started Heinen's grocery store, and he said to his father, he said, you know, this is a wonderful opportunity for me. Oh, I'm so excited. And his father very sternly said, when are you going to stop playing a little boy's game and come back and help me in the grocery store? And guess what he did? He went back to help him in the grocery store. The story of Mrs. Morhard is, I mean, of course I wrote it, but I think it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, her life alone is quite amazing. Al Jr. Morhard and I, he doesn't like to be called Junior anymore, have had the opportunity to go up to the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown and talk about her and her leagues. And we've had opportunities to talk about the book across the country. We'll be going back to Cooperstown this June. Well, we actually won't be going back. They've just announced it's going to be virtual. So, but we will be talking to attendees at the Baseball Hall of Fame again about Mrs. Morhard. So finally, she's getting the recognition that she deserved. At the reunion that they held 30 years after the Leagues, the boys who had all turned out to be wonderful people and good citizens wanted to get her recognition then. But she said, oh no, she said, don't bother. She said, I've gotten what I wanted. All you boys have turned out right. So that was her focus, and she did what she wanted. But now she's getting some recognition, some well-deserved recognition. And we hope you'll read the book and hear her wonderful story. And thank you once again.